Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me for what should be a very informative and educational session. Sometimes when we think about science, we only focus on what is happening when we look at, say, histology, anatomy, physiology, but we forget just how powerful emotions are in terms of derailing health, making us unwell. And one of the very important lessons that I've seen over this whole pandemic period is that a lot of people have suffered trauma in multiple different ways. The challenge we have is one, will people acknowledge that they have been traumatized, or will they continue to ignore it and pretend that everything is fine? We've had all kinds of traumas. People who have been unvaccinated lost their jobs, lost their families. People who have been vaccinated and have been injured. People who are involved in trying to move things forward only to realize that the narrative is falling apart and they're losing trust. Clinicians, professionals, scientists. There is a lot of trauma that is going on. What are the options that they have available to them? And so, without further ado, I'm going to bring in my guest, Gary De Rodriguez, who has exceptional experience with handling these things. So, Gary, can you hear me?
I can, Philip. How are you, my friend?
Excellent.
Excellent. Now, what I want you to do, Gary,
I want you to
do a quick
introduction
of yourself.
Very good. I'm very happy to do that. So welcome, everyone. My name is Gary De Rodriguez. I'm CEO of a company called Peopleistic. We have offices in Perth, Australia, and in Dallas, Texas. And I live over in Arkansas, which is just a short drive over to Dallas when I have corporate meetings. I will say that this has been a long, lovely journey. I started in the AIDS crisis, launched my whole career working with people who were dying at that time. Diagnosed, you were a skeleton in 3 months. I began doing public trainings after that, and people from corporations came in and actually worked with me there and invited me into the organization. So I've been doing this for 37 years. I've coached about 30,000 people worldwide. My main modality that I use is a process called NLP and HNLP, which is Humanistic Neuro-Linguistic Psychology. Out of those disciplines, I developed a very powerful, very simple process for decoding your nervous system from traumatic events. It does it in less than 30 minutes. The change is permanent and can be self-facilitated, which is also incredibly important. But this is my goal. This is my life purpose, is to get this information out into the general public so people can reclaim their lives from the experiences that we've had. Especially COVID caused so much broad-based trauma across the planet that it's never really quite been addressed. So when Philip and I met, I was like, wow, like, you're doing some amazing things. And then when he figured out what I did, we were like, let's get on a call and talk about it. So here we are.
Excellent.
Now,
it does as though there is still an echo,
which the audience are not felt. Can you do me a favor and jump to your other intro in the meantime?
I will get onto my iPhone. I'll click out of this now.
Yeah. So yes, we're going to talk about things here. We had tested a problem before with regards to an echo, and it does seem as though it's an ongoing issue. So we're going to switch around instruments for a few minutes. So just give him a minute to come back. But yes, the reason why when I was speaking to him, I realized that, listen, this is somebody who I think has something very important for my audience to hear, to listen to. Now, I have noticed very often that my audience tends to only want to focus sometimes on the challenges, scientific issues around COVID. But in reality, we have to look way beyond that. And we have to look more importantly at how health is integrated with emotions. And if we have unresolved issues emotionally, they are going to present in time with health-related issues. So here you're back again, Gary. How is that?
I'm getting
I'll let you get set up. I'll let you get set up in the meantime. Yeah, so This is really an important point, and that's what I want to dig into in terms of, while we're talking about just in terms of health, let's also make sure that people's mental stability and their focus and their ability to move beyond the pandemic is actually addressed. What I have observed is that for many people, the acknowledgement of being afraid and having fear is almost too big a step to go. They will not acknowledge that they were afraid early in the pandemic, and that fear was primarily the driver for for some of the things that they did. Hi, Gary, we're back again. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Yes.
Perfect.
So yes, I was saying, Gary, that just a little bit to prepare the audience for some of the points that I'm going to deal with in terms of the pandemic issues. But I wanted to make sure that people understand a little bit more about what you can do in terms of your experience. Give me an example of some of the high-level people you've worked with and interesting situations you've come across with them.
Okay, very good. In the history of my coaching, I've worked with a series of CEOs, some movie stars, but a lot of professional athletes. And what happens in this one case, this gentleman was inducted into the Hall of Fame for his sport, and he was running a variety of different addictions. Now, about 2/3 of all addicts have unresolved childhood trauma or other traumas as well. Because what the trauma does is that it stresses the body over a period of time of unresolved, especially in the childhood, because our nervous systems are so sensitive as children that when we experience traumatic events, it becomes even more impactful, more damaging. And the constant dump of cortisol and adrenaline through the body from hypervigilance becomes that kind of corrosive biochemical that just starts to deteriorate our bodies because we're under constant stress. And stress is one of the, I think, biggest contributor to ill health that there is. So the constant vigilance, the constant feeling like the other shoe's going to drop, or I'm expecting something bad to happen, but it hasn't happened yet, are running in our minds over and over again. Relationship betrayals, the core events, triggers that happen on the outside that bring up all the emotions from the past traumas. Because our subconscious mind, I mean, we have a reptilian brain that clicks on that will dump cortisol and adrenaline when we get triggered. And the fear may or may not be actual and may be perceived. So what happens is when we are constantly under this state of stress, it becomes very hard for the immune system to fight off the inflammation that gets triggered in the genes, because this constant stress and hypervigilance will trigger off the genes for inflammation. And inflammation is what we're all dealing with and all fighting off for more optimal health.
And
So,
when you think of your expertise then with your top level person, they clearly were struggling with prior issues. Is that
absolutely. And so what this individual did was he got lost in an addiction, and the addiction was caused because all addictions caused from shame, from his early years with his mother and father. He was always a high performance athlete, and his parents made their identity around his performance. So he had lots of trauma around being rejected for underperforming and lots of trauma about being punished for underperforming. So love got mixed in with performance, and really a whole new level of narcissism got born in him because it was all about what he could do, when he could do it, and then the beliefs and the pain of being disconnected from unconditional love was overwhelming for him. His relationship of a very long period of time, I think it was about maybe 35 years, was really deteriorating because he was having affairs. Now, the bottom line is this happens for lots and lots of people. Our wounds show up in our relationships because wherever love is, everything unlike it starts to show up as well. but it all relates back to trauma. And if we really look at where the traumatic episodes and limiting beliefs really manifest themselves, it is in our relationship. Could I tell one more story?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was working with a couple down in Australia. He was a miner that went up to the Northern Territories and began to, he was working with Rio Tinto, I think it was, and his wife had an office job down in Perth, Australia. What happened for them, which was very fascinating, this shows you how couples will have their core childhood wounds triggered off. He grew up with a mother that was very dependent, very emotionally unstable, mentally unstable, flew into rages, had uncontrolled emotional states. So he was constantly being traumatized by an overreactive environment. She, on the other hand, her father left their family when she was 4. He was, of course, her dad. And when he left, he never saw them again. And as a consequence of that, her abandonment issues were just huge. So what would happen is he would go up to the mines to work for 3 months. She would go into an unconscious state of abandonment, high stress. What if he's having an affair on me? All these future fears that weren't even a reality, but that's where she would go, thinking she was going to be left again. When they would call each other, he would just blow up because she would start ranting and raging and yelling at him, just like his family of origin. So what was happening is both the dynamics of both of those individuals, they were being triggered off by their deepest core wounds. And as a consequence of that, impossible to build a bridge to mutual understanding unless they began to lessen the impact of those childhood wounds that made them both hyperreactive. And this happens all the time in relationships. It ruins people's lives and it ruins children's lives.
When you think about that, because one of the things that struck me is that when we had lockdowns and these people who had been working, had their lives, had separate existences, were able to cope, when they were put together for long periods of time, that in itself was a huge trauma.
Very much so. And, I always say that the best seminar in town is the seminar of being in a relationship, because you have to look into the mirror of the other person to see things about yourself that you didn't think was there, but it's there. And as a consequence, if we don't have tools to lessen the micro traumas that happen, like there was a comment that came in where a young lady said, I think we all have PTSD. And that is very much the truth, because trauma is not something that happens to you. It's something that happens inside of you. And as a consequence of that, one person who maybe have had years of micro trauma, small events that, along their path, another person who hasn't had many of those experience the same event. The person with a compaction of micro traumas, they will break. Their bodies will break. They'll get a disease. Their spines will go maladjusted. The other person who hasn't had that compaction of micro traumas will be like a piece of bamboo in the wind. They'll be able to weather that particular event. So it becomes really important that we have a system and a tool to start cleaning up our past. I think I wrote out 68 memories, events that I know I've been carrying with me my probably whole life. And this was back in 2022. I wrote out these events and I thought, okay, I'm not going to carry these into 2023. I'm going to neutralize them. So I self-facilitated myself in this process that began to start really minimizing the impact of all of those emotional states. Most importantly, I got to a state of peace I don't think I've ever been in.
You've just said something there, because I know in the background the kind of strategies that you will use. And I don't know how many people have come across this kind of thing, the neuro-linguistic programming that you can use to address specific traumas. And that's central around what you do in your coaching. Can you, in a simple way, explain to people what really is NLP.
It stands for Neuro-Linguistic Programming. I lean towards the evolution of NLP, which is a process called Humanistic Neuro-Linguistic Psychology, which is a bit more of a spiritual evolution of NLP, because we're more than a machine that gets programmed. So there's a group of trainers that actually evolved from NLP, formulated new techniques, which the memory resolution technique that I created is part of the HNLP repertoire. So it is a bit of an evolution to the traditional NLP. Lots of people know NLP, but this is absolutely an evolution to it.
And what really, the way that I think of it, when I think of any kind of brain programming, is I say that if you want to see it in real life, when you see ants walking along a track and you rub your finger across it and you break that connection, suddenly they go in all directions. And that's kind of my explanation as to what neuro-linguistic programming can do with patterns that people have. Is that too simplistic?
A bit. Let me further explain. Neuro stands for how input data enters the five senses. So how we're receiving about 2 million chunks of data per second. We delete, distort, and generalize all that data down to about 7 pieces plus or minus 2. The linguistics is that words or language are the symbols that represent our thinking. So in the Native American tradition, the Hopi elders would always say, watch your words with great care because it creates your future. Buddha would say, your thought manifests as the word manifests as the deed hardens into character. So it begins with our thought, but is represented and kept alive with our language. So a big emphasis is on language. The next is programming. As we repeat these patterns, we hardwire them into our nervous system, creating neurosynaptic connections that create super highways of neurology. Our thoughts are electrical charges that follow the path of least resistance. So if we continue to habitually think and feel in a certain way, we simply begin to create that habit. And that habit, in my belief system, begins to become a very dense filter that we see our reality through. You know, the reticular activating system sort of kicks in a lot because when we're looking at our habits, we actually begin to start eliminating the evidences of contrary information to what we solidly believe to be true. And if we're constantly having these micro traumas occur to us, our beliefs get refortified, but in the negative. And unless we begin to start unraveling the emotional glue that holds them all together, we will not be able to actually break free of them very easily.
And, you know, I want to ask you something because, as I said, I know my audience and I know I have a good understanding of how most of my audience think. And a big proportion of my audience, because I've been always challenging the narrative from COVID, and that's part of the reason why they've followed me, is that a lot of them have been traumatized by what they have been through in COVID. Okay. So they have been through either job losses, breakup of relationships with family. They have been ostracized, criticized, called all kinds of names, and they have been traumatized in a way that I think it's quite difficult for them to even explain. There's a lot of anger when I look at the comments. A lot of people are really, really still hurting.
And well, they should be. So let me explain one way to begin to start dealing with that. There are several ways, but the most simplest way is to make a list of the small traumas that have occurred. And we can call them big traumas. Just make a list of them. And don't go into the story of them because we don't want to run the narrative which further reinforces it. We want to just be able to list it. Example would be 5 years old in the backyard, or 28 when my boss had that conversation with me, or when 37 when my wife walked out the door, or my husband walked out the door. So make that list of all of those major and minor events. I wish I had time to actually demo this process, but we don't have the time. But let me explain it as succinctly as I possibly can. It works with eye movements. So there's patterns of which you follow for the eye movements. When the eyes are moving, it activates the central nervous system, the hippocampus on the right, the hippocampus on the left, and the amygdala. So you're getting lots of activity when the eyes are moving. Memories, if we all just got a memory, like a happy memory right now, you would notice that memories are only pictures, sounds, and feelings. So when people look up, they're sorting for images, visual images. When they look laterally, they're sorting for sounds. When they look down, they're sorting for feelings. So what we do is when the trauma happens, it enters our five senses either in predominantly a visual, maybe it's predominantly an auditory, maybe it's predominantly a kinesthetic, a touch, or a pull on the body. Could be anything. But we have eye patterns that actually lock it in. And what I mean by that is I'll take off my glasses for a minute and demonstrate this. When a person asks you questions, what will happen is the eyes will sort for the picture, sounds, and feelings of that question that's been asked. So what happens is, if you notice, and this is an important aspect of this, that the eyes were going to reveal that the event comes in and there is literally a pattern or a combination to a safe that the eyes will go to unlock that specific memory. So watch next time you ask a person a question, their eyes will sort in a number of different ways. They're looking for the information. They're looking for the pictures, the sounds, and the feelings of the data that you've asked them. So what becomes really important is to know that every single event, every single trauma that's come into you has this kind of key that unlocks the full representation of that trauma. So what we do is we go into the feeling of the event. We begin moving our eyes in random directions. And what happens there is we start scrambling up how that event originally entered our nervous system. Next, we elicit all the best things that's ever happened in that person's life. Times they were loved, times they felt close to God, times that they almost fell down laughing, times they did things they didn't think they could do, but they did it. And we represent them by a variety of different resource symbols, like a color, a symbol, a sound, a smell, a taste, a rap, a word. We're scrambling up the event with our eye movements, and then with the power of the mind, we re-imprint the original visual representation of the memory with all of the resources of our life. What happens is that once, after maybe 10 to 15, sometimes 20 minutes of eye movements and the re-imprinting process, the person will stop, the body will completely begin to relax, and you can see the neutralization happening in the facial structure. You can see the breath beginning to come back. After they stop the movements, I go back. I say, take 3 deep breaths. They do. I say, no, go back to that event and tell me what it looks like now. And this is a general effect of it. They'll say, it looks like a black and white photo in a photo album. I'm outside of it looking at it. I know it happened, but I don't feel anything about it anymore. How's that? It's because
that is powerful stuff. So I want to. I'm just as you were talking there, as I said, I think this is. I think that where people need to start is sometimes the most obvious things that are in front of them. So let me give you an example for my audience. One, as I said, with the recent COVID trauma, one, they probably may have been afraid. This is the unvaccinated cohort, but they chose to say, actually, I don't want to do this. It would have gone against somebody, whether it was work, and they would probably remember the day when they said, I'm not going to do this, and somebody shouts at them, or they had the argument with their family, and they can very clearly remember these painful moments throughout that period of time where they couldn't travel for a wedding or they couldn't go to someone's funeral, and they have all of these things that are there under the surface. So you are saying make them find every single one of those and then sequentially disrupt them so that they now look at the pandemic period as a historical event rather than an emotional event.
That is exactly right. And I would support people as well to go back in time, because it's just not the pandemic. Most people who have where the COVID has exacerbated itself in the body, I would suggest that it's very possible that those individuals have been carrying unresolved trauma for a very long time, pre-pandemic. And so when the pandemic hit and the next round of traumas that occurred to them gets compacted onto the already existing ones, that's when our bodies begin to become compromised. And that's when the inflammation really flares up. We're sitting on so many experiences, all of us, that it is really important to take trauma not as, oh, this big event, oh, I got a car accident or someone beat me up. It isn't what happens to you, it's what's happening inside of you. The meaning you give the event, the emotional impact it has inside of you can give PTSD and have, or at minimum, micro traumas that compound over time. So this is why if we're going to really tackle inflammation, we can't just tackle it physiologically. We have to tackle it psycho-emotionally as well, because it is proven that unresolved traumas, constant hypervigilance, is a great contributor to diabetes, to lung disease, heart disease, cancers, obesity, and of course, drug addiction, alcohol addiction. This is about having something in your hands that works on your nervous system that you can apply to yourself, and that you can begin to start lowering the temperature of the emotional states that you have been suppressing all of these years.
I wanted to jump in on that point there when you're talking about the inflammation. One of the things I've found when I've been doing the research, certainly into long COVID type issues. Now, some people don't believe long COVID is a real thing. I'm telling you, it's very real and a very complex condition. Now, one of the patterns that I had noticed, which is what led me to gut inflammatory processes, because the same people who were having issues before the pandemic seem to be the same people who are then having issues after they got infections or sometimes vaccinations. But what I came clearly to understand was that COVID, the infection, it's almost like the petrol on the embers of inflammation. And what was subclinical, where somebody didn't notice it, if they then got an infection, that inflammation just blew up.
Yeah.
And that then caused the symptoms. And I keep saying to people, you can't just put out the fire. You need to deal with the embers of the fire. Else, the next time you get exposed, the same thing is going to happen again. And I get the analogy for what you're talking about. If the emotional traumas, the embers of them are not dealt with, they will then flare up in ways that people cannot even make sense of.
That's exactly right. And there's nothing scarier than to feel like like your body's no longer working, you no longer have control of it, that it's doing some pathway that you don't understand, and it's painful, it's scary, it's frightening. And so I have great empathy for anyone dealing with long-term COVID, because I know how challenging to be sick is. But the bottom line is we are also strong. We're also courageous. We can get the education to help ourselves minimize the impact of our life and the heartbreaks that have happened to us, which we've all had, and to start changing the picture, sounds, and feelings that represents the compaction of our memories so that they feel neutral. And our reptilian brain isn't clicking off every time we get triggered by something and we go into fight, flight, or freeze. Because what a lot of people do with unresolved trauma, they project fear into their future instead of possibility. And they end up paralyzing themselves by fearful thoughts about the future. And this process also works for future fears, because unless we tackle it and we have a system to do it, we're going to heal more slowly. For me, it's like I want to put tools in the power of the hands of the people so that they can work with themselves, because most, except for you, of course, Philip, but most people in the medical community have taken the emotional equivalent out of the equation. And for me, it is the biggest part of the equation. Everything begins with a thought, which creates an emotional state, a resonance through the body, then represented by language. And then as we feel these things, we do behaviors guided by those particular feelings that we have. That hardens into our character. And then we become sort of entrapped in the bubble of our own making.
I wanted to jump into that point you made about the doctors and the whole health sector. There is an inertia. There is something that they are almost burnt out to the point that they just can't do anymore. They needed the pandemic to be over after 2022. That's really what they needed. They put all their resources, all their eggs, all their hopes into the fact that within a couple of months, couple of years of just pushing through this, everything will then go back to normal. What is very scary and very traumatic is what happens when it doesn't go back to normal, when the pressure is still ongoing, when people are getting sick and people don't understand why. And it's not a few, it's a lot of people. And they don't have the energy emotionally, physically, mentally to push through this. What do they do?
Well, I will say this. I have a lot of respect for the medical establishment, especially those nurses and doctors that work through the heat of the pandemic. In the very beginning, it was a horror story. But I'll go back to the same point I made before. The doctors that I've worked with trauma, and the nurses that I've worked with trauma, all are carrying this compaction again of cases they've worked with, people that they've lost, their own inabilities to help people, which is why originally they went into the field. So there's a lot of inbuilt shame and a lot of just complete overwhelm that has impacted their lives. And then we couple that overwhelm with when they go home and they have fumes to give their family, then that creates conflict within the home. So they get it from both sides of the equation. Within the workplace and in the home, they will get it as well because they've got nothing else to give. So the way to begin to start creating some sort of work-life balance is they have to, again, lessen the traumas that they're carrying. That's the first step, because that will then add energy to their body. Think about it this way. Like, our subconscious mind keeps things suppressed. And that suppression, because we don't have the energy, the resources, or the ability to oftentimes resolve what's happened to us. So it keeps the emotions suppressed. When we suppress the emotions, we suppress our immune system. And especially for women, because when women suppress their emotions, if they're unhappy or they need to scream into a pillow, do it, because it is equivalent to suppressing your immune system. So we have to begin to understand the impact of emotions on our physical bodies and to assist people in the healthcare field to resolve their own traumas as well, and to find that work-life balance by honoring what they're actually feeling, allowing themselves to cry, allowing themselves that breakdown if they have to have that breakdown. But at the same time, come back on board, express the emotions, move the energy, come back on board.
I want to pick something here, unpick something, because I'm reflecting carefully on some of the traumas. And in a sense, I realize that I've been blessed by the fact that I was doing research, looking at various things. And very early on, I stopped being afraid because I understood what was happening. But I remember when I didn't understand. And I remember when one of my colleagues died. One of the things for people who say this was just a flu, they forget that we lost colleagues. We have never lost colleagues in a flu. There is nothing worse than thinking about the person that you know dying on intensive care, and there was nothing you could do. Now, that trauma, so for me, at that time, this would have been about March, April, how it manifested for me was that I was waking up in the middle of the night claustrophobic. I couldn't think of a worse way because I'm naturally claustrophobic. It was terrible. It was like the worst experience that you could have. And there was nobody you could talk to about it. Now, when I reflect on that moment, and I think, goodness, can you imagine carrying that burden? Because many of them still had to go to work not knowing if they would be next. That kind of fear then has to be suppressed because they have to go to work.
Absolutely.
So they had to push it down. How in the world do they go back to finding that when they don't even want to acknowledge it?
Well, there's always this one root thing. We always have to have clarity about where we are and what we desire to create next and where we're going. If we know that our next steps forward in our lives in this journey of life, if we want to drag all of that pain with us, it's going to be far more burdensome than being able to quiet down the mind and the nervous system by a very simple but very effective process. So in my belief system, it is not about so much how do I keep the emotions contained, how do I help myself resolve what's happened, that experience, that really horrible experience is resting on a foundation of something else. Let me go there. In my mind, what I've done before is, where have I been claustrophobic before? Where have I felt enslaved or entrapped? Where have I feared for my life? Where have I done all of those things that would add to the compaction of this event that's happening now? If we don't heal our history, and I mean emotionally neutralize our history, what happens is it compounds and compounds and compounds over time. And when another event happens, and as life is, it does happen, then we're sitting on that whole construct of unresolved feelings. That is when the body starts to go, okay, I've had enough. I'm shutting down.
And a lot of people are saying that when they are walking around and they are looking at people, it's almost as if the general public has lost their emotional connections. The word that is being used is they appear to be like zombies. People are just existing. They just can't seem to find a place. This trauma is exceptionally deep at the moment. This is part of the reason why I'm talking to you, because I realize that we have to find a way to get people out of this rut.
Well, let me throw out some thoughts on that, because it's really true, Philip. But I'll still default back to, you have to do your historical work, release as much of the traumatic compounding traumas as you possibly can, because this is what I've been doing, and I will swear to you, my life has gotten better. The happy story about the gentleman I was working with, who was a pro player in a particular sport and was inducted into the Hall of Fame, and he had this addiction. He did all of this work on himself. I coached him. I'm still coaching him, actually. And it's been a year now. We have like diffused it all. Him and his wife are back together, stronger than they have ever been in like the 35 years that they've been married. They walk through the fire together. They loved each other past their flaws. And they have done such deep work on themselves as individuals. Because when I do coaching work with couples, I always work with the individual issues first and then come together as a couple, because unless those individual issues are healed, they'll never be able to not project those into the relationship dynamic. They have to come in as two whole people, not two broken people looking to the other one to mend them. So we have to do our own work first. The next thing I want to say is, and I can only speak from my own personal experience here, because I've had more trauma than most people. From early, I mean, I'm talking diapers on. I was an IV drug addict at one point, trying to anesthetize myself from the trauma that happened to me as a little boy. And that was, between 14 and 18. I just went down this very dark road because I couldn't handle the emotions of the betrayal that I thought love should have been, that didn't exist in my family system when I was a kid. So I was quite distraught. And what I know that happened for me is I used methamphetamine, intravenously, because it gave me this high that I felt like I returned to the love that I actually am. Of course, it's complete destruction and a complete lie. But for 3 hours, I was like, poof, I'm good, and it almost killed me. But here's the bottom line: in that stage, in that phase, I had a spiritual experience that got me clean and sober in 12 hours. And I'm not talking religion. I'm not a fan of religion necessarily. I bless everyone's path and let them have what they have. And wherever they find that love for whatever they think the creator is, I'll celebrate it. For me, it's something quite different. It's about creating a connection. And you hit the word right on the head there. It is about the connection. We are all disconnected from a sense of purpose, from a sense of belonging, from a sense that I'm being guided. And when we look at our relationships, which I think is a reflection of that deep desire to connect to something bigger, deeper, longer, and long-lasting, eternal, when we break our connection to that, and we break our connection to each other, we are alone, and we have no place to look then for that silent suffering of the soul to be connected. So for me, I have I meditate every morning for at least an hour and a half. I do my best. I still struggle in meditation for sure, but I do my best to make that connection every morning. And it's my meditation. It's my private relationship to what I consider divine for me. It's not a religion. It's not a book. It is my personal relationship. And I just invite people, regardless of what you believe, even if there is nothing on the other side. I said to myself, well, if there's nothing on the other side, at least I'll live this lifetime in a hallucination that makes me feel good. So how do I lose? I don't lose.
Yeah. No, that is very, very powerful, very true. So when we think, therefore, and what I want you to do for me now, Gary, because I do know that for anyone who is interested, there is a link there with regards to Gary's course, there, www.garyscourse.com, and you do help people through this process.
Yeah.
But let's say not everybody can afford it, not everybody can have the time to do it. I want you to give something to the audience here that may be simple that they can take with them as a tool that can be used to help them get beyond where they are, even in small steps, even if it's a longer period of time. Is there anything you can think of, Gary, that would be of value to these people who are listening?
Oh, do we have another 5 hours? Yes, I have a whole bunch of stuff, but just let me speak to that. First of all, the self-facilitation course is really inexpensive. You go into a Zoom room. I lead you through the process. It's pre-recorded, but there's plenty of time to do all the prep work to do the process. Once you go into that particular product, it's lifetime membership. I just want people to use it and clean up their past. And it's pretty inexpensive. So just take a look. The next thing is I want to do a quote. And the quote contains within it a tremendous amount of wisdom. Two primary things: language, direction of thought, and acts of kindness. So here's the quote. The thought manifests as the word. The word, when spoken, creates emotions and manifests as the deed. All behavior is emotionally driven. The deed, through repetition, hardens into your character. So watch your words and your thoughts with care, and let it spring for concern for all living things. For as a shadow follows the body, as we think and as we speak, so we become. Directionalize your language. Stop saying words like I can't and I have to and I need and I want, all words of disempowerment. I'm going to go out on a limb here. All religions say that we're made in the image and likeness of this thing called God. We don't know what it is necessarily. But what we do know, and then where everyone can agree, it creates. If it creates and we're made in the image and likeness of it, that means we create. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we create? We create by the focus of our minds, by the words that represents our thoughts, by the emotions we carry, by the actions we do. So my invitation is to clean up the thoughts. We have to neutralize the emotions that create the filters from our experiences, because all of our past experiences create the filters, and what we made up about those experiences create the filters that we see our reality through. If the filters that we see our reality through is loaded with unresolved negative emotions, which means unresolved limiting beliefs, how do you think we're going to see the world? So we have to first minimize the emotions that act as the glue that holds these pictures, sounds, and feelings together, that makes them feel real. For most of us, we created very significant beliefs that govern our life from the intelligence, wisdom, and life experience of a small child. Birth to 7 is the imprint years. So if many of our foundational beliefs that guide the way we see the world is based upon the life experience and intelligence and wisdom of a small child, don't you think it needs to be reassessed? It does. My whole life is about living till the end of it gracefully, hopefully, and getting these tools out into the hands of as many people as possible, because quite frankly, I cannot stand to see people suffer. I really can't. That's why I launched my whole career in the AIDS crisis, because no one would step up. And I organized the first AIDS educational seminar in Southern California. Sacramento, all the legislators, all the immunologists from the different hospitals, and I organized open forums so people could understand what the heck that was. What is this thing? A little bit like COVID, like what is it? But what I know is that we have to empower ourselves. If we're made in the image and likeness of this thing that creates, don't ever limit the thought that your thinking isn't powerful and that your word isn't powerful, because your word is the birthplace of your future.
Powerful, powerful, remarkable. I can't think of a better thing for us to leave with the audience. And I think that this is what I'm saying. Those words, that direction, the fact that so many people have these unresolved issues, compounded by the stresses that happened in the pandemic, it's definitely, if they weren't sick before, it will make them sick. So
Yeah.
there is a responsibility. One, first heal yourself, and then try and heal all those who are around you and bring them somewhere. I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is that there's no point trying to heal or help someone else if you haven't done it yourself.
You
know,
can't someone down a road you haven't traveled yourself. The
Yeah.
bottom line is, when they go onto that link, click on the self-facilitation, TMRT it's called. There's 4 different trainings there. Just click on that one. Least expensive, that's a self-facilitation one.
Excellent, excellent. So yes, so thank you very much, Gary. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing these wise words with us, principles that people can take with them. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us to the end, and I hope that you will find great value from his content. Gary, thanks again. I'll ask you to stay with me until after the outro, and thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.